The figure appeared first as a smudge of heat against the far edge of the alkali flat, a wavering distortion where the sun hammered the white earth into a mirror of the sky. Elias watched it from the shade of the livery stable, his hands still working a length of stiff leather, his movements slow and deliberate, honed by years of repeating the same task until it was no more a thought than breathing. He had been mending a bridle for a horse that had gone lame, a simple job for a quiet afternoon, but his eyes stayed on the horizon, tracking the slow crawl of the shape as it resolved itself into a horse and rider. The horse walked with its head hung low, a gait that spoke of final miles, and the rider was a slight thing, slumped in the saddle with a weariness that seemed to seep into the very air around them. The town of Harmony Creek watched too, though it pretended not to. Faces appeared in the dusty windows of the mercantile, and a man spitting tobacco juice from the porch of the saloon paused with the stream still on his lips. They were a town of watchers, of weighers and measurers, and this newcomer was being weighed. Elias felt the familiar weight of their collective judgment, a silence that was heavier than any shout. He looped the waxed thread through the awl's hole and pulled it tight, his knuckles white for a second before relaxing. The horse was a poor-looking beast, a rack of bones draped in a dusty hide, and it stumbled as it reached the edge of town, its knees buckling for a moment before the rider pulled it back to its feet, with a gentle but firm hand on the reins. It was a woman. Her face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a layer of grime, but the set of her shoulders was not one of a person accustomed to defeat, only to exhaustion. She did not look at the windows or the porches, her gaze fixed on the water trough in the center of the dusty street, and she slid from the saddle not with grace, but with a heavy, controlled drop, landing on her feet with the solidity of a stone. The horse drank, long and deep, its sides heaving. The woman laid a hand on its neck, a small gesture of comfort that seemed to cost her something. Elias finished his stitch and set the bridle aside. He watched her run a hand over the horse's flank, feeling the jut of bone beneath the skin, and he knew the animal would not see another sunrise. He knew the look of a thing that had given all it had to give. The town knew it too. Their silence was a verdict. She was alone, her transport was gone, and the high peaks to the east were already gathering the first hints of autumn blue, a warning of the cold to come. She would not last. That was the thought passing behind the still faces in the windows, the unspoken consensus of a people who understood the brutal arithmetic of survival. Elias picked up a different piece of leather, a thicker strap for a saddle girth, and began to work it with neatsfoot oil, his hands moving with the same steady, unhurried rhythm. He did not know her name or her story. He only knew what he saw. A woman at the end of her road with a dead horse and 100 miles of unforgiving country in every direction. The sun beat down. The town held its breath. Afternoon. The woman sold the saddle for a pittance to the livery owner, a man whose eyes were small, hard beads of calculation, and the transaction was conducted in the same watchful silence that had greeted her arrival. She took the coins without counting them and walked toward the only place in town that offered anything for sale besides whiskey and dry goods, the land agent's office. Elias saw her go, her back straight, her steps even despite the dust that caked her boots and the weariness that must have settled deep in her bones. The office belonged to Silas Croft, a man who had acquired most of the surrounding territory, not through violence or grand schemes, but through the patient exploitation of desperation, buying out ranchers after a bad winter or a dry summer, his voice always calm and reasonable, as he named a price that was both an insult and their only option. Croft's cruelty was transactional, as clean and cold as a newly minted coin. Elias knew the man, had dealt with him once years ago over a disputed water right, and he had seen the hollowness behind the polite smile, the complete absence of anything resembling empathy. The woman was walking straight into a spider's web. Elias could have said something, could have offered a word of warning, but that was not his way, and it was not the town's way. People made their own choices, and they lived or died by them. To interfere was to take on a burden, to tie your fate to another's, and Elias had spent a lifetime cultivating a solitary existence. He had his small plot of land a mile out of town, his horses, his work. It was enough. He watched her push open the door to Croft's office and disappear inside. The men on the saloon porch murmured to each other, a low rumble of speculation. A bet was made, a coin flipped. The odds were on her being gone by the week's end, on a stagecoach heading east or west, it didn't matter which. The alternative was a small, unmarked grave in the town's sparse cemetery, a fate that had befallen more than one hopeful stranger who underestimated the teeth of a high-country winter. An hour passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. The door to Croft's office opened again. The woman emerged, a folded piece of paper clutched in her hand. Croft stood in the doorway behind her, a thin smile on his face. He had the look of a man who had just concluded a very satisfactory piece of business. "Good luck with the old Miller place," he said, his voice carrying in the still air. "It will require a firm hand." The men on the porch stopped their talking. The Miller place. A collective understanding passed through the silent audience. The Miller place was a ruin, a collapsed cabin on a worthless patch of rock-strewn land 2 miles north, its roof caved in, its well gone dry years ago. Old Man Miller had died in it one winter, frozen solid in his chair, and no one had bothered to fix it since. It was a place you pointed to as a cautionary tale. To buy it was not an act of hope. It was an act of final, desperate foolishness. The woman, whose name they would later learn was Lena, did not acknowledge Croft's comment. She simply walked toward the mercantile, the deed in her hand, her expression unreadable. She bought a sack of flour, a side of bacon, a dull-bladed axe, and a box of nails. She carried the supplies herself, making 2 trips, her movements efficient and devoid of wasted energy. She was buying for a siege. The town watched her last trip as dusk settled, her silhouette a dark, determined shape moving against the fading light, heading north out of town on foot. She did not look back. The silence that followed her departure was different. It was no longer just watchful. It was the silence of a jury that had already passed sentence. The winter would be her executioner. Elias packed his tools, his hands feeling stiff in the cooling air. He swung into his own saddle and turned his horse not toward his home, but north, taking the long way around, keeping to the ridges. He just wanted to see. The Miller cabin was worse than he remembered, a skeleton of a building picked clean by years of wind and neglect. One wall sagged inward as if it had sighed its last breath long ago, and the roof was a sieve of missing shingles and rotten timbers, a lattice of decay that offered a clear view of the darkening sky. The wind, already carrying the sharp bite of the coming cold, whistled through the gaps in the chinking, a low, mournful sound that was the cabin's only welcome. Lena stood before it for a long time, her meager supplies at her feet, and from his vantage point on the ridge a quarter-mile away, Elias could see the stillness of her posture. She was not surveying a new home. She was assessing an enemy, cataloging its weaknesses, calculating the cost of the fight ahead. He expected to see her shoulders slump, to see the first crack in her composure, the moment when the sheer impossibility of the task would crush her. But it never came. She simply dropped her supplies, untied the bedroll from her back, and got to work. She did not start with the gaping hole in the roof or the crumbling wall. She started small, methodically clearing the debris from the interior, tossing out splintered furniture and the nests of long-gone rodents. She worked until the last light failed, and then she built a small, careful fire in the lee of the one solid wall, its flames a tiny spark of defiance against the vast, indifferent darkness. Elias watched her eat a piece of hard bread, her movements slow, her gaze fixed on the flames. There was a discipline in her, a stripping away of all things that were not essential to the next task, and then the one after that. He had seen that look before, in soldiers and in men who had been trapped in winter camps. A kind of focused calm that was more formidable than any outburst of fear or rage. He turned his horse and rode home. The image of the small fire burned into his mind. Days later, the town settled back into its rhythms. The woman in the Miller cabin, becoming a piece of local folklore before she had even lived a full week. They spoke of her as the Fool, or Croft's ghost, a person already consigned to the past. They saw her walking the 2 miles to the creek for water, carrying 2 heavy buckets on a wooden yoke, her back straight and her pace steady. They saw her gathering fallen branches for firewood, her pile growing with agonizing slowness. They saw her trying to patch the roof with scavenged pieces of bark and sod, a hopeless task that the first real storm would undo in an instant. Her struggle was a public spectacle, and their refusal to help was a wall built of shared principle. This was a hard land, and it did not reward weakness. Pity was a currency they could not afford. Elias saw it all from a distance. He saw her axe glance off a thick piece of pine, the dull blade failing to bite, and saw her stumble with fatigue, but never fall. He saw her hands, already wrapped in rags, become raw and chapped from the relentless work. He found himself altering the path of his daily rides, checking his own fence lines on the northern edge of his property, his route always taking him within sight of her cabin. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. He was simply watching a predictable story unfold, a tragedy in slow motion. He was a witness, not a participant. One afternoon, two of Croft's ranch hands rode out to her cabin. They didn't dismount, just sat on their horses, their expressions a mixture of amusement and contempt. They said something Elias couldn't hear, and one of them laughed, a harsh, grating sound that carried on the wind. Lena did not respond. She kept her back to them, continuing her work of mixing mud and grass to patch the wall, her movements not faltering for a second. The men stayed for 10 minutes, a silent, menacing presence, and then they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust to settle over her. It was a small cruelty, an almost meaningless act of intimidation, but it was the kind of thing that wore a person down, the constant reminder of your own vulnerability, of how little you mattered. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. It was one thing to watch a person battle the elements. It was another to watch them be toyed with. The casual nature of the malice, the sheer sport of it, was what settled in his mind and would not leave. That night, the wind shifted. It came down from the high peaks, no longer crisp but sharp, carrying the scent of ice and distant snow. The first true cold had arrived. The days grew shorter, the light taking on a thin, watery quality that offered little warmth. The leaves of the aspens on the high slopes turned a brilliant, fleeting gold, and then were stripped away by the wind, leaving behind a forest of bare skeletal branches. Every morning, a fragile layer of frost coated the ground, a silver blanket that clung to the shadows long after the sun had risen. Lena worked with a quiet, desperate urgency, her world shrinking to the few hundred square feet of her crumbling shelter, and the daily punishing labor required to keep it from collapsing entirely. She had managed to patch the worst of the holes in the roof, but her repairs were a flimsy patchwork, no match for the weight of a heavy snow. She had sealed the walls with a mixture of mud and dry grass, a primitive chinking that cracked and fell away as it dried, and the wind still found its way inside, a constant, chilling whisper that promised worse to come. Her pile of firewood was still pitifully small, a monument to the inefficiency of her dull axe. Each swing cost her precious energy, and the wood she managed to split was often splintered and uneven, burning too quickly. Her hands were a mess of blisters and raw cuts, and she took to wrapping them in strips torn from her own clothing, but the cold seeped through the thin fabric, turning her fingers numb and clumsy. The town continued to watch, their predictions growing more certain with each passing day. "She won't see the first snow," became the common wisdom, spoken with a grim satisfaction in the saloon and the mercantile. It was not that they wished her ill, not precisely. It was that her failure would confirm their own understanding of the world, that the land was unforgiving, that survival was a brutal calculus, and that they, the survivors, were possessed of a wisdom she clearly lacked. Her struggle validated their own hardness. Silas Croft made a point of riding past her cabin once a week, always on his way to or from the northern pastures of his vast ranch. He would rein in his fine black horse a short distance away, observing her for a few minutes with that same cold, polite smile. He never spoke to her after that first day, but his presence was a statement. He was waiting. He was the patient vulture, circling a dying animal, confident that the land and the coming winter would do his work for him. One afternoon, he stopped Elias on the road into town. "Still keeping to yourself, Elias?" Croft asked, his voice smooth as polished stone. Elias just nodded, his hand resting on his saddle horn. "I see you ride the North Ridge sometimes," Croft continued, his eyes unblinking. "You get a good view of my new property from up there, the Miller place." He paused. "A foolish investment on the woman's part. I almost feel sorry for her." "Almost," Elias said, his own voice flat. Croft's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I made her a fair offer to buy it back, 10 cents on the dollar. For her own good, you understand. She'll be wanting to get clear of here before the snow flies." She refused. He shrugged, a small, elegant gesture. "Some people have to learn the hard way. The land has its own lessons. It doesn't abide pride." Elias said nothing. He just looked at Croft, his gaze steady, until the other man's smile finally faltered. Croft cleared his throat, gave a curt nod, and spurred his horse on toward town. The conversation, like the visits from his ranch hands, was another small turn of the screw, another piece of casual pressure designed to break her spirit. But Elias was beginning to suspect that her spirit was not so easily broken. He had seen the way she moved, the way she husbanded her strength, the way she met each new setback not with panic, but with a weary, stubborn recalibration of her plans. She was not a fool. She was a survivor who had run out of options, and she was making her last stand with the only tools she had, her own 2 hands and a will made of iron. That evening, he looked to the mountains. The peaks were gone, swallowed by a bank of low, heavy clouds the color of slate. The air was unnaturally still, the way it always was before a blizzard, and the silence was profound, a deep, ringing emptiness that felt like the world holding its breath. He knew the signs. He had seen them 100 times before. A big storm was coming, not just a dusting of snow, but a real, wall-moving, life-ending blizzard. It would be here by morning, and the woman in the cabin, with her leaky roof and her tiny woodpile, would be right in its path. He would spend a long time afterward wondering about the exact moment he made the choice, but he would never be able to pinpoint it. It was not a single sudden decision, but a slow, gathering weight, an accumulation of small injustices that had finally become too heavy to ignore. It was the sight of her exhausted horse, the sound of the town's silent derision, the memory of Croft's smug smile, and the image of her working alone, her back to the mocking laughter of his men. It was the profound, unshakable wrongness of it all, the way it settled in his bones like the coming cold. The land was hard, that was true, but it was the cruelty of men that soured the air and made survival a bitter thing. He stood on his porch and watched the sky, the clouds thickening and sinking, a great gray ceiling being lowered upon the world. The temperature was dropping, the kind of deep, penetrating cold that found its way through the thickest wool. He thought of her in that cabin, with its paper-thin walls and its roof that was more whole than shingle. He thought of her huddling by a small, sputtering fire, feeding it stick by stick through a long, dark night while a blizzard raged outside. He thought of Old Man Miller, frozen in his chair. Not here, not again. He went to his barn, the air crisp and sharp in his lungs. He didn't saddle his horse for a quick ride. He packed for a siege. He filled a canvas sack with salted pork, coffee, and a half-dozen loaves of hard bread. He took his own axe, its blade honed to a razor's edge, its hickory handle smooth and familiar in his hand. He grabbed a heavy, oiled tarpaulin, 2 thick wool blankets, and a coil of rope. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements sure and practiced. There was no hesitation. The time for watching was over. As he led his horse out into the yard, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were small and dry, skittering across the frozen ground on the leading edge of the wind. They were messengers, the scouts of the great white army that was massing in the mountains. He swung into the saddle and turned north, the snow stinging his face. The world was shrinking, visibility closing in as the snowfall thickened, the familiar landmarks of the landscape dissolving into a swirling curtain of gray and white. The wind began to moan, a low, rising note that promised a terrible fury. He rode hunched against it, his hat pulled low, his focus narrowed to the few feet of ground visible in front of his horse. The 2 miles to her cabin felt like 20. The wind clawed at him, trying to push him back, and the snow was coming down in earnest now, thick and wet, sticking to his coat and his horse's mane. He found the cabin more by memory than by sight, a dark shape looming suddenly out of the maelstrom. A faint, flickering light shone from its single window, a fragile beacon in the growing storm. She was still there, she was still fighting. He dismounted and tied his horse to a scrawny pine that offered little shelter, pulling a blanket over the animal's back. The snow was already ankle deep, and the wind was a physical force, a solid wall of moving air that made it hard to breathe. He walked to the door of the cabin, the sack slung over his shoulder, the axe in his hand. He didn't knock. He just pushed the door open. Lena was on her knees by the hearth, trying to coax a flame from a handful of damp twigs. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide in the dim light, her face smudged with soot and exhaustion. For a moment, she looked like a cornered animal, poised for flight or fight. A gust of wind and snow followed him into the room, sending the pathetic flame sputtering and threatening to die. He pushed the door shut behind him, plunging the small space into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the embers. The silence stretched between them, thick with the howl of the storm outside. He could feel her fear, her suspicion. A lone man appearing at her door in the middle of a blizzard was not a prelude to an act of kindness in her world, he guessed. He dropped the sacks on the floor with a heavy thud. "Storm's coming," he said. His voice sounded rough, unused. "I know," she answered, her voice a low rasp. She got to her feet slowly, grabbing a heavy piece of firewood, holding it like a club. Her knuckles were white. "You'll die here," he said. It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact. He looked at the flimsy roof where snow was already beginning to drift through the larger gaps. He looked at her pathetic pile of wood. She didn't answer. She just stood her ground, her chin lifted, her eyes burning with a fierce, defiant pride. He saw then that pity would be an insult to her, that an offer of rescue would be a confirmation of the weakness everyone else saw. It would make him just another one of them, another person judging her and finding her wanting. So he didn't offer to save her, he offered a partnership. He held up his axe. "Your axe is dull," he said. "Mine's sharp." He let the simple words hang in the air. It was an offer of a tool, not charity. It was a recognition of her work, an acknowledgement that she was a fellow laborer in the brutal business of survival. It was a language of competence, the only one they both truly understood. He watched her eyes move from his face to the axe, its polished head gleaming in the firelight. He saw the tension in her shoulders ease, just a fraction. She looked at the piece of wood in her own hands, then back at him. She gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made. He didn't wait for another word. He went to the wall where she had stacked her firewood, picked up a thick, knotty log, and set it on the dirt floor. He swung the axe. It bit deep into the wood with a satisfying crack, splitting the log cleanly in two. He set up another piece. The sound of the axe striking true, again and again, became a steady rhythm inside the small cabin, a counterpoint to the wild shrieking of the wind outside. A rhythm of shared work, a rhythm of survival. They worked without speaking, a silent, coordinated effort against the storm. While Elias split the wood, turning her meager pile into a respectable stack of fuel, Lena took the tarpaulin he had brought and climbed onto the rickety table, forcing the stiff, oiled canvas into the largest gaps in the roof, using the rope to lash it to the exposed rafters. Snow and wind blasted down on her, but she worked with a dogged persistence, her movements sure and economical. There was a surprising strength in her small frame, a wiry toughness that had been hidden beneath the layers of exhaustion. He saw the skill in her hands as she tied the knots, pulling them tight with a sailor's efficiency. She was no stranger to hardship, no stranger to making do with what she had. They were two solitary people, accustomed to relying on no one but themselves. Yet in the crucible of the storm, they found a strange and simple harmony. They moved around each other in the cramped space, anticipating each other's needs. A grunt or a nod, their only communication. He would split a log, and she would be there to stack it. She would point to a loose board in the wall, and he would be there with the hammer and nails he'd brought. They were a team, forged by necessity. Outside, the world was disappearing. The blizzard had descended in its full fury, a whiteout that erased the sky and the land, leaving only the storm itself. The wind screamed like a living thing, and the walls of the cabin groaned under its assault. Snow began to pile up against the door, sealing them in. The cold was a palpable entity, a predator scratching at the walls, trying to find a way in. But inside, a small pocket of warmth and order was being carved out of the chaos. The fire in the hearth, fed by the dry, well-split wood, now burned bright and hot, pushing back the shadows and the chill. The tarpaulin overhead snapped and billowed with the wind, but it held, and the snow no longer fell directly into the room. They had made the shelter defensible. Just after midnight, there was a lull in the wind, a sudden, eerie silence that was almost more unnerving than the noise. And in that silence, they heard a new sound. Horses. 3 of them, their hooves muffled by the snow, stopping just outside the cabin. Elias stopped his work, the axe held loosely in his hand. He looked at Lena. Her face was grim, her eyes fixed on the door. There was only one person who would be out in this storm. A heavy fist hammered on the door. "Hello in there," a voice called out, thin and reedy against the wind. It was Silas Croft. "Having some trouble, are we?" The voice was thick with false concern and real satisfaction. Elias moved to the door, stood beside it, and just waited. Lena remained by the fire, her hand once again resting on a heavy piece of firewood. "I know you're in there," Croft called again, his voice rising with impatience. "No need to be proud. I've come to make you a final offer. For your own good, sell me the deed, and I'll see you get a safe ride back to town." There was a long silence. Elias could picture him out there, sitting on his fine horse, a smug smile on his face, certain he had finally won. He was not expecting an answer. He was expecting the door to open and for a broken woman to fall into his arms, grateful for his mercy. Elias reached out and lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door, setting it firmly in its iron brackets. The sound was loud and definitive in the small space. It was the only answer Croft was going to get. Outside, the silence stretched. They could hear the stamping of the horses, the creak of saddle leather. Then, Croft's voice, no longer smooth, but tight with anger. "Have it your way. The winter is long. Let's see who the land chooses." They heard him wheel his horse around, heard the muffled sounds of the riders departing, swallowed by the returning shriek of the wind. Croft was gone. For now. Elias turned from the door. He met Lena's gaze across the firelit room. She gave him another one of those small, sharp nods. It was a look of understanding, of alliance. They had survived the man. Now they just had to survive the night. The storm raged for 2 days and 2 nights. It was a living entity of wind and ice, a relentless assault that tested every nail, every board, every patch and prayer that held the small cabin together. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by a roaring, white void. Snow drifted up past the window, burying the cabin completely, plunging them into a strange, dim twilight. The only sounds were the howl of the wind in the chimney and the steady crackle of the fire. The only light was the dance of the flames on the rough-hewn walls. Inside this small, besieged fortress, a quiet rhythm of life took hold. They rationed the food Elias had brought, eating salted pork and hard bread in near silence, the simple act of sharing a meal a profound communion in the heart of the storm. They drank coffee, boiled in a small pot over the fire, the warmth and bitterness a welcome shock to the senses. When there was no work to be done, they sat on opposite sides of the hearth, occupied with small tasks. Elias mended his tack, his strong, calloused hands moving with a practiced grace, the smell of leather and oil filling the small space. Lena, to his surprise, pulled a small bundle from her bedroll. It contained a set of fine needles, thread, and several pieces of worn deerskin. With an intense, focused precision, she began to repair the tears in her own worn clothes. Her stitches so small, and even they were nearly invisible. She had a skill, a quiet competence that the town, in its haste to judge her, had never imagined. She was a mender, a fixer. It was what she had been doing all along, with her life, with this cabin. He was just seeing it up close. They rarely spoke, and when they did, it was in short, functional sentences. More wood. The coffee is ready. The wind is shifting. There was no need for stories or explanations. The storm stripped away everything that was not essential. Their shared presence, their combined effort against the cold and the dark, was a conversation more eloquent than any words. In the long hours of the second night, with the wind at its peak, a section of the tarpaulin tore loose with a sound like a gunshot. A torrent of fine, powder-like snow poured into the cabin, instantly chilling the air. Without a word, they were both on their feet. He boosted her up onto his shoulders, and she fought against the wind, her fingers numb, retying the rope while he held her steady, the snow plastering his face and hair. They worked as one, a single organism with a single purpose: to endure. When it was done and the breach was sealed, they stood for a moment in the center of the room, breathing heavily, covered in snow. A shared look of grim triumph passed between them. They were winning. On the morning of the third day, they awoke to silence, a deep, profound, and absolute silence. The wind was gone. Elias unbarred the door and pushed. It wouldn't budge. A wall of solid snow blocked the exit. He took a shovel head he'd found in a corner and began to dig, scooping away the packed snow and throwing it into the room. It took an hour of hard labor before he finally broke through into the open air. He stepped outside into a world transformed. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun on the new snow was so bright it was painful to look at. The landscape was a sea of white, every sharp edge softened, every imperfection buried under a thick, pristine blanket. The air was clean and cold and still. The world felt new, washed clean by the storm. Lena came and stood beside him, her face tilted up toward the sun, her eyes closed. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. They had survived. They had faced the worst the winter could throw at them, and they had endured. The town had sworn she would never survive the winter, but the winter had come, and she was still standing. She was not alone. When the thaw finally came months later, it came with the rush of a freed river. The great mounds of snow shrank, the creek swelled, and the first green shoots of grass pushed their way through the muddy earth. The world returned to life, and with it, the town of Harmony Creek slowly became aware of a fact they had long dismissed. The woman in the Miller cabin had survived. She had not only survived, she was beginning to thrive. The story of Elias spending the great blizzard at her cabin had trickled into town, carried by a hunter who had seen his horse tethered there after the storm. There were whispers and speculation, but no one dared ask Elias directly. His silence was a wall they knew better than to try and scale. They simply watched, their judgment now tinged with a grudging curiosity. What they saw surprised them. Lena, with Elias's help on the weekends, had rebuilt the cabin. not patched it, but truly rebuilt it. They had felled trees from the small wooded patch on her land, and with his sharp axe and her quiet determination, they had hewn new timbers and raised new walls. The roof was solid, the door hung straight, and a small, sturdy porch now faced the morning sun. She had also revealed her trade. The deer skins Elias had seen her mending were just the beginning. She was a tanner and a leather worker of incredible skill. She traded with the Ute hunters who passed through the high country, acquiring pristine hides in exchange for mended clothes and pouches. She worked the hides with a knowledge that seemed ancient, using brains and smoke to create leather that was supple and strong, far superior to the stiff, chemically tanned hides sold at the mercantile. She began to craft gloves, moccasins, and bags, her stitches perfect, her designs simple and beautiful. A trapper bought a pair of her gloves and declared them the warmest he had ever worn. A rancher's wife commissioned a satchel. Slowly, cautiously, a trickle of commerce began to flow to her small cabin. People started calling her by her name, Lena, and the epithets of the Fool and Croft's Ghost faded into memory. Silas Croft watched it all with a quiet, simmering resentment. His easy victory had been stolen from him. He had counted on the winter, on her isolation, on her spirit breaking. He had not counted on Elias, and he had not counted on the sheer, unyielding toughness of the woman herself. He could not move against her openly. Her small success was now a point of local pride, a story the town told itself about its own capacity for tolerance. To harm her now would be to expose his own petty cruelty. He was diminished, not by a fight, but by her quiet competence. He was a man who understood profit and loss, and he had profoundly miscalculated her value. Elias found a new rhythm to his life. His solitary existence had been breached, not by a demand or a debt, but by a shared task that had grown into a shared life. He never moved into her cabin, and she never moved into his house, but the 2-mile path between their homes became as well worn as a cattle trail. He would bring her venison, and she would have a hot meal waiting. He would mend her fence, and she would repair his saddle. Their conversations remained sparse, made up more of comfortable silences than of words. They spoke the language of work, of shared burdens, and mutual respect. There was no need to name what had grown between them. It was as solid and real as the new walls of her cabin, a shelter they had built together against the cold. One evening in late spring, they sat on her new porch, watching the last of the sun's rays paint the mountains in hues of rose and gold. The air was soft, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Lena was stitching a leather pouch, her hands moving with their usual fluid grace. Elias was cleaning a rifle, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism a familiar, comforting sound. Croft offered to buy my land again, she said, her eyes not leaving her work. Elias paused, a cleaning rag halfway down the barrel. He offered a fair price this time. Elias waited. I told him no, she said simply. She looked up then, and her eyes met his. In their depths, he saw not the haunted weariness of the woman who had arrived on a dying horse, but the calm, steady light of a person who had found her place, a person who knew her own worth. He just nodded. He picked up the rifle and continued his work. The sun set, the first stars appeared. The quiet settled around them, a peace that had been hard-earned and was all the more precious for it. It was enough. A year passed, then another. The cabin was a home now, with a garden in the front that produced beans and squash, and a small corral out back that held 2 sturdy horses. Lena's leatherwork was known throughout the county, and people came to her not as an outcast, but as an artisan. Harmony Creek had changed, or perhaps it had only been reminded of a truth it had forgotten. That strength was not always loud, and that community was not a fortress to keep people out, but a shelter to bring them in. Elias was older, the lines on his face cut a little deeper by the sun and the wind, but his movements were just as steady, his hands just as capable. The quiet solitude he had once cultivated had been replaced by a quiet companionship, and he found it suited him better. He had not sought to be a savior. He had simply offered a sharp axe to a fellow worker, and in doing so, had discovered a part of himself he thought had been lost long ago. He had learned that a man's worth was not measured by the fences he built to keep the world out, but by the gate he was willing to open. The world is full of winters, and it is full of people who will tell you that you are not strong enough to survive them. They will judge you from the warmth of their own fires. They will watch you struggle, and they will wait for you to fail, because your failure confirms the hardness of their own hearts. They will tell you that you are alone, and that you are not enough. But sometimes all it takes is one person who sees not your weakness, but your will. One person who offers not pity, but a tool. One person who is willing to stand with you in the storm and share the burden of survival. We have all faced a winter of our own, a time when the cold felt absolute and our resources felt pitifully small. The question is not whether the storm will come. The question is, who stood with you when it did? Who saw the fighter in you when everyone else saw a fool? Let us know in the comments below what you think it truly means to be strong, and if you've ever had someone, or been someone, who was willing to share their axe against the cold. Thank you for listening, and for being a part of this story. Your time and attention are the warmth that keeps these stories alive. If you enjoyed our time together, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us to continue bringing you stories of quiet strength and earned redemption. Until next time, be well and look for the helpers.